Alright guys, I'm gonna have to be kinda quiet. You may need to turn your volume up a little bit, because of all the Blackboard issues. I'm getting a later recording on this, so my whole clan is in bed and doing the best I can here. So, in summary, the Lewis and Clark expedition did turn out to be a very good thing. I mean, they established good relationships with dozens of tribes, and they collected invaluable information. So by the time the election of 1804 came around, Jefferson easily won this election. I mean, you can look at the electoral votes. Pinckney gets 14 to Jefferson's 162. His presidency, though, was filled with escalating tensions from Britain and France. Britain and England, again, are at war once, or I'm sorry, Britain and France are at war again. And both sides warned the United States not to trade with the other. And, I mean, it almost sounds like a child being torn between two divorced parents. 200 and 500 U.S. sailors were taken prisoner by the British, and Jefferson passed the non-importation laws, banning certain British goods from the United States. Unemployment rose in New England, grain lost value, and cotton went unpicked. So by the time we see the election of 1808, Jefferson decided not to run again. And again, at this time, there's no term limits, but he felt that since Washington had served only 2 terms, then he should also do that as well. So we see the Secretary of State, James Madison, who ran on the Republican ticket, and again, Pinckney, who ran as the Federalist. Madison barely won this election. Electoral votes, 122 to 47. I mean, it looks like there's a big difference there, but it wasn't just the sweeping win that we had seen, like, with Thomas Jefferson. One of my favorite parts of talking about James Madison is talking about Dolly Madison. She is absolutely one of my personal favorite first ladies. And unfortunately, I don't get a whole lot of time to talk about Abigail Adams. I could go on for days and days, but I only get to give you the high points. I mean, with Dolly Madison, I could also go on for days with her. If you ever have time to read a book called Parlor Politics, it is absolutely fascinating, and it sheds the light on the early women of Washington. At any rate, Dolly really did find a wonderful balance between queenly and Republican virtue. She held Mrs. Madison's weekly crushes, and they were public ceremonies suitable for a new republic. Rather than a private space such as a dining room, Dolly designed 3 rooms in the White House to hold public events. And the Madisons dubbed their entertainments, they called them drawing rooms. And they had rather than the levees, because the levees had such a negative connotation surrounding them, and they were just simply too English. These drawing rooms still functioned to give people access to the president, and while the party was public, the access to private conversation even allowed President Madison opportunity to even reconcile a diplomatic conflict with the Minister of Spain at one point. And while while President Madison was there, people identified these events as Mrs. Madison's parties. Dolly placed, what she would do is she would place an announcement for the events in newspapers as a general invitation for anyone who was around. And the drawing rooms were open to all Americans regardless of class. Rather than sit on a elevated perch like Martha Washington did, Dolly worked the room with class and grace. She actually stood for most of these events, and she created a political space very unlike any other in Washington. It was fluid. It was a very freewheeling atmosphere of political activity. It took in all numbers and combinations of people. However, it offered ample opportunity for private conversation. It was a large space where everyone could be seen, and it included both Republicans and Federalists. It included cabinet secretaries, members of Congress, and visitors. But I will say, not everyone loved these events. They were noisy. The people often hated the refreshments. People often hated the people. But one simply could not afford to miss them, especially if someone wanted an advancement opportunity, or maybe they had a relative at home who wanted to go into politics and they needed to make connections, and those connections were made at these events. They also allowed her to negotiate occasionally on behalf of the president for support. She was highly political in nature, yet she was veiled by the atmosphere of which she created. So while these things are private, they are in the female sphere. She is able, in an essence, to be political. And Madison's presidency was not all about mingling with politicians and the public. It was quite the contrary. There were Indian troubles in the West with France, and England was plagued with his time in office. Tecumseh the Prophet, who was a Shawnee chief of the Ohio country, he solidified a pan-Indian confederacy. And by pan-Indian, I'm meaning very, it's just basically everyone who is a Native American should join together. And what they did was they resisted further white encroachment on their territory. And it attracted thousands of followers. Northern tribes renewed their ties with Britain for fur trading. And with that, they gained a source of food and weapons. So if the U.S. went to war with England, there would be a serious problem. And we see this kind of come up with the War of 1812. Now, back to Dolly. Dolly and her female counterparts, they did talk about their husbands' careers. There was little talk of women's rights. However, women could assume an active presence in civil affairs. Everything was fairly resistant to change. Women had no legal rights, no political rights, and it was rooted in an idea called the femme couverte, which is known as the covered woman. And it's rooted in the notion that the husband would act on behalf of the whole family, and he would do what was best for them. So as far as women voting, that's not really a thing. It's looked at that he will vote for her. Now, women's duties during this time were to obey her husband. Her property was his. So if she had property before they got married, say she was a widow a widow, and she had received her husband's land, when she remarried, that land automatically went to him. Her domestic and sexual services were his. The children were legally his. Women had no right to keep their wages. Women had no right to make contracts. Women could not sue or be sued. A single woman had a few more rights. And you'll see where some of those women they decided not to remarry over those kind of things. Divorce, the only thing that really changed was the notion of divorce. Prior to the Revolution, only New England recognized limited divorce. After that, the majority of states recognized divorce, except for South Carolina by about 1820. But divorce was not socially acceptable, and divorce wasn't socially acceptable even up until the 1950s. I mean, it just really was not acceptable. Someone said that divorces should never be allowed except for the protection of the innocent party and for the punishment of the guilty. So there were those problems. Now let's move back to Tecumseh a little bit. We talked about the problems with, you know, if they are trading with Britain through Canada, and they will fight on behalf of Britain if something were to come up, and that's exactly what we see by 1812. And Indian conflicts kind of merged with a wider conflict with Britain. You have the Non-Intercourse Act, which prohibited trade only with Britain and France and their colonies. It restored trade with other European countries and helped with the high unemployment rate and economic concerns. And there was also this idea of impressment, which was forcing American soldiers into the Royal Navy. And remember those U.S. ships that Britain had seized. We talked about this a little bit earlier in the lectures this week. Those men were forced to serve in the Royal Navy. So the War Hawks were this group of men who were all about, you know, let's do this. And one of those was Henry Clay from Kentucky. He was a Republican Speaker of the House. Another was John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. And they welcomed another war with England. And one of the reasons for it was people were constantly so afraid that the United States was not going to make it. And it also kind of justified attacks on the Indians and would bring an end to the impressment. So they actually proposed an invasion of Canada. And so to be sure that they were ready, they went ahead and they quadrupled the size of the army. And they declared war in 1812. Now, of course, not everyone supports this war. New England and some Middle Atlantic states opposed the war. The South and the West were strongly for it, but the United States was not prepared for this war in England. They feared the effects. Some feared the effects on commerce, and there really did come a point when there was a big shift for the United States in this. You know, for a while, you know, Detroit fell very quickly. Chicago fell quickly. New England was not producing troops fast enough. New England merchants were illegally trading with England. And there's absolutely an election in here which really distracts from everything that's going on. And Madison does win. And, you know, it could have added a whole new element of issues had we seen Clinton win here. But it does shift for the U.S. They start getting some victories at sea. They captured and burned Toronto around April of 1813. They defeated the British at Lake Erie. They drove the British Army from Detroit back to Canada. And in October of 1813, they defeated the British and the Indians at the Battle of Thames, where Tecumseh was killed. And we will pick up there in the next video, which will be the last one.